we did indicate last week that we will talk about three important books or documents. Let's call them documents. The first was the Africanist Manifesto, the PAC founding manifesto of 1959. The second being the document that was written by Peter Raboroko shortly after the formation of the PAC, titled The Africanist Case. And thirdly, the speech made by Robert Sobukwe on the inaugural convention. So those were the books that we said we would be talking about today. But the way in which I have prepared to deal with this presentation is that for 20 minutes, I'm going to make a quick presentation for 20 minutes. And shortly thereafter, I will be taking a couple of questions that you might have. And I'm going to hope that you will act in such a way that towards the 15th minute, then you can start posing those kinds of questions, and I will be responding accordingly. So the structure of the arguments of the case that I'm going to present here for the next 20 minutes is as follows. I am going to deal with Section L and Section A of the PAC manifesto. So Section L deals with the question of social relations. It deals with the question of how we as human beings can live in peace and in harmony. And this was the question that the PAC was really asking. And it was saying this was a question that has bothered humankind for a very, very long time. It has not only been bothering, so to speak, the people of South Africa or the people of Europe or people of some place elsewhere in the world, but it has bothered human beings generally. And so the question, however, the PAC frames this question in Section L, not in Section A. In Section A, the PAC deals with the historical development, the historical movement of relations between Africa and Europe. And that's where really we are going to begin. So today we're going to talk about two key themes. The first theme will be that of slavery. The second theme will be that of colonialism. Because we've got to understand, comrades, the importance of history in terms of why we are where we are today. And I need not remind you that today, apart from being in a lockdown, this nation and this continent of Africa has been in a lockdown for more than 500 years. We have been in a lockdown for more than 500 years. And the biggest lockdown we have been in as Africans is an economic lockdown. It's not a health lockdown. It's an economic lockdown of poverty, of hunger, of inequality, a lockdown of patriarchy and all forms of subjugations of the African people. And so the PAC tries to trace the historical development of relations between ourselves as Africans and Europeans as invaders, as foreigners, as dispossessors, as land thieves, as settler colonists. And so it's important, therefore, to begin the series of these lectures and political online engagement by looking at that question, at those two themes, slavery, colonialism, in talking about the question of how can we live in peace and in harmony. So let's begin with this question of slavery. The PAC in Section A says that the significant portion of our social milieu begins with the expansion of European commercial markets. I want to repeat this key and important point. It begins with the expansion of European markets. In other words, to understand the situation of Africa, we've got to go to Europe. We've got to start to, locate the European and find out what was the European up to and what had happened 500 years, more than 500 years ago. And what had happened more than 500 years ago was that we were sold as slaves to Europe, and we became the property of the Europeans. We became a thing. We were sold, and we didn't get anything for our being sold, but everything we gave away to the Europeans. What we gave to the Europeans was our bodies, our physical labor, our time, our sweat, and our spirit. We gave ourselves to the Europe. We gave everything to the European. And this was consistent if you think about the philosophy of Aristotle, who was a Greek philosopher, one of the most respected philosophers, who philosophized nonsense about, the questions of human relations. According to him, there were people who were slaves by nature, and there were people who were rulers by nature. This kind of philosophical thinking, prevailed in the entire European thinking in terms of how human relations should be like. And that's exactly the kind of philosophy that saw us as Africans being bought and sold in the ports of Liverpool. And here I'm not talking about the Liverpool of You Will Never Walk Alone, but I'm really talking about Liverpool, And so that was the challenge of slave trade and the challenge of slavery. We need to distinguish two key things here, comrades. One is the question of slave trade, and the second is the question of slavery, generally speaking. So I have said in the beginning, we were sold as a personal property. Secondly, I have said we then got into Europe, and when we got there, we worked in the plantations. We were cultivators. We were planters in the plantations of sugarcane, tobacco, any other crop you can think of, whether it was corn or whatever. We were engaged in physical labor. The difference is that we were not given anything in return. And this is important for us to talk about. In other words, our labor was used and we got nothing in return. Now, what happened to slave trade was that in the 18th century in Europe, it was called a period of enlightenment, a period of reason. Thomas Paine even wrote a book during that period titled The Age of Reason. John Stuart Mill wrote a book on the question of liberty. Adam Smith wrote a book in 1776 on the question of the wealth of nations. So it was a period of, reason, a period of liberal rights, civil rights against those that were feudal lords and those that were monarchies, etc. So this period of enlightenment happened at a time when we were slaves in Europe, when we were working in the plantations. And it was precisely during that period that we were in America, working in the South of America, in the plantations of Mississippi, in the plantations of South Virginia, in Texas, in South Carolina, and everywhere you can possibly think of in the South. We were slaves there. A huge chunk of Africans were slaves there. It is estimated that about 13 million of us, were shipped to Europe and we worked in those plantations. But at the time in the United States, you've got to remember, at the time in the United States, the United States itself was a colony of the Englishmen, of the British. And so it was itself fighting for its own independence. So when Thomas Paine wrote the book titled Common Sense, he made a point that it was critical for the Americans to be free, and it was critical for mankind to be free. That's what he said. But when the Americans were free, which I want to call that a national bourgeois revolution of the Americans against British rule, when they became free, the Americans, the Africans were not free. They were still not free. And this is a key point to make. Slavery continued. That was in 1776. We continued to toil. We continued to labor in Mississippi or in the South of America. Slave trade was abolished, comrades, in 1807 in Britain, and but slavery did not end. Slavery continued, and slavery was abolished in 1834 in Britain. Can I just make a point here about, you know, the abolishment or the abolishing of slavery in Britain? Slave owners in Britain were taking charge, were in charge of the House of Commons, of British Parliament. They were businessmen and they were in Parliament. And we know today that there are people who are businessmen and who are in Parliament. And these people who were slave owners in Britain in 1834 refused to abolish slavery. We paid them with our labor, but we got nothing in return when slavery was ended in 1834. How did we pay? And why did we pay? Like I said, the folks refused. You know, the whole idea that we as Africans, you know, should be free. They fought tooth and nail to defend slavery against the abolitionists. Parliament and government ended up negotiating our freedom as Africans in Britain. We paid slave owners more than, you know, £20 billion to end slavery. In other words, for slavery to end, the slave owners had to be paid, and then we were supposedly free immediately thereafter. And this has been the pain of the African. Fast forward from 1834 very quickly to 1860 and go to America. In America, slavery had not ended, and slavery had not yet been abolished at the time. In 1860, a gentleman by the name of Abraham Lincoln was to supposedly end slavery. And again, the South of America refused because they were the ones who benefited substantially from slave trade. So they refused the entire idea of abolishing of slavery in America now, not in Britain. So what had happened then there was that in the South of America, and this is very key, in the South of America, in Mississippi, Virginia, South Carolina, Texas, etc., in those specific places, it's important to point out that they removed the contestant from the ballot, the senators, because they were slave owners. So they removed the president as a nominee and as a contestant. But nevertheless, Lincoln did win the election. After he won the election in 1861, they seceded. They separated themselves from the Union, the United States, because they wanted to keep the enslavement of the Africans. They wanted to keep the abuse of African labor. They wanted to continue to increase and to accumulate capital at the expense of African labor, and they did not want to be disturbed for doing that. As a consequence, the United States got into a civil war over precisely the question of slavery. They got into a civil war, and that's a very important point to make. Eventually, in 1865, slavery was again abolished in the United States. But let's point it out. It is not slavery that got abolished in a systematic sense, in a structural sense. What happened was at a legalistic level, at the level of a code or a level of a law, it was abolished. But at the level of structure, at the level of economic relations, slavery was not necessarily abolished. In fact, slavery has not yet been abolished today. And if you think about this question, you can think about people here in Tanzania, how much money they earn, and you will understand the point I'm trying to make here. Recently, when we were going to the lockdown, we were told, for example, that about 4 million people in this country earn roughly less than 6,500. You know what that means? It means they can't pay rent. It means they can't buy groceries. It means they can't send their kids to school. It means they can't have a decent life. It means they spend their money going to work as opposed to spending money, trying to build shelter for themselves. It means that 4 million people in this country are, they pretty much earn a slave and a slave wage, and about 18 million people being under social grants in this country. This is ridiculous for a country that claims to be free, for a country that claims to be based on the principles of liberation and democracy, etc. It's absolutely unacceptable. But that is the nature of what happens at the level of structure. It doesn't matter what you say in law. What matters is what happens at the level of structure of society. And that's why slavery then ended at the level of law, but not at the level of structure. And that's why slavery continued in a different guise. So what is this different guise? And this gets us to the last portion of our talk. This different guise was the whole question of colonialism. But remember, colonialism had already been taking place for quite some time, but it was not in many instances direct colonialism. It was indirect rule. But now colonies had wanted to come directly because the end of slavery meant that they had difficulties with procuring labor without having to pay for it. So they had then to come directly to Africa, and they had to come to Africa more strongly and entrench themselves deeply. I just want to keep that chronology and say that it was in 1884 and 85 that then they decided to cut Africa as a cake, as their cake. And they had to cut Africa and do as they please with it. And it was a period that they called the scramble for Africa. I just want to take a case here of the Democratic Republic of Congo, if there's anything democratic about it. But I just want to take something about it as a case of what really happened in Africa after the enslavement was declared to be immoral, and when colonialism became more entrenched. What happened in DRC as a specific case is that a gentleman by the name of Leopold had taken over the Congo, and he was the constitutional monarch of Belgium. He had taken over Congo as his personal property. And when I say personal property, I mean that he took over and it became a PTY Ltd, a private company, his private company. A couple of important things happened. The first one was that he engaged seriously in the mutilation and in forced labor. He forced Africans to work without pay, as was the case, and this was in the late 1800s. And when Dunlop was discovered in Scotland, and they needed to build tires for cars, they then engaged in a process of forced labor in Congo. So in Congo, they discovered rubber. And this rubber had a lot of African people killed. A lot of African people were cut off their hands, they were killed, they were raped, they were rounded up and forced to extract rubber so that rubber could be exported to Europe because it was needed in Europe, in Scotland. And so we paid with our labor again in the form of DRC as Africans to build Europe. What we've basically done in Europe was to build Europe. We built bridges in Europe. We built railways in Europe. We built plantations in Europe. In Europe, there's nothing we did not build. We built the European. We made the European what the European is today. And the European in return made us what we are today, you know, and that is a very important point to make. We built the infrastructure. So when they came for direct colonization, they came in Africa and they built colonial courts. They built military. They built the police. They established themselves. They used force. They used guns. They used weapons. But why were they capable of using weapons? It was because Europeans industrially had already developed and had surpassed us at the level of industrial development, because industrial revolution had already begun in Europe. And so they had the power of the gun, not the power of quantity. Of course, we were many, but they had the power of the gun. And this point is critical to make. And then they imposed tax. So there are two things that are key here that we must take into account. One is that colonization also meant the establishment of jurisprudence, European jurisprudence, European laws, European ethics, European conceptions of human rights, European conceptions of property relations. Remember, when they came here, property to us was a common good, was a collectively owned entity. Land was commonly owned. But when they came here, they introduced their views of a Lockean view of property rights. They employed their Stuart Mill's conceptions of individual property rights. So they built courts, a court system, the entire jurisprudence, and then they built an army, and they established police. And then in order for them to pay for this police, and it's important to look at the origins of taxation, because in order for them to pay for this police, they had to tax us. They had to take the little we had. They had to take our cattle. They had to take our land in exchange for taxation. That was our form of taxation. If we could not pay the tax, they forced us. They killed us. They raped us. They destroyed us. They destroyed our entire humanity. They imposed taxes on land, on cattle, on houses. In the case of Congo, for example, they went on to destroy villages that were refusing to pay tax because they were capable of living on the land as peasants. They destroyed the peasantry. In this country, you know the story of Nongausa in the Eastern Cape, where 400,000 cattle was destroyed. And then thereafter, the people here in the Eastern Cape had to go and work in the mines because they had no one to go and work in the mines. They needed somebody. How are you going to take off people off their lands when they don't have no need of going to work because they work their land? So what colonialism did was then to displace the African, to remove the African from the land, to poison the land in some instances, but also to create propaganda, against us as lazy lads who did not want to work, etc. So I have highlighted here 2-3 key things about what colonialism did. And the first one is to show that the colonist could not manage us without direct rule because we were too many. So they had to build an entire colonial administration. But they had to enlist the help of some Africans in order to rule over us. And that is where the question of the material interests come in. Because some of those who cooperated with the Europeans who were Africans cooperated on behalf of their own economic interests. They didn't just cooperate because they were happy to cooperate. It was a question of how shall human beings live together in relative peace and harmony, especially if there are, opportunities of making money, of enriching self, even at the expense of other Africans. So this was always a very key and central question. So it's important then to say that these two concepts that I have engaged today, because I don't want to waste your time and talk about a lot of other things and bring too many details at once. But the point to make is that colonialism had to establish itself by force and by law. But I do want to make it clear that law, as I have said earlier, some people think of the law as the thing, and for the law as to be the most powerful thing. And that's why they think that if you go and change a law in parliament, you have solved the problem, because they think that a piece of legislation can solve a problem. Slavery has never been solved for the past 500 years, even by pieces of legislation. Multinational corporations, for example, don't care about environmental protection. They don't care which ecological system they destroy, where. That's why they want to go to Tolobeni, the Australian company, and destroy the environment. It does not matter how much law. You can legislate 1,000 pieces of legislation. But if you have not fundamentally altered the colonial structure, you're wasting your time. So you can see that everything we do today, as long as we sit in parliament and pretend to be making a law that will solve a social problem, an economic problem of human relations, the problem of human relations does not get resolved by a piece of legislation. It has never been solved by a piece of legislation in the past. It has been solved by a revolution. That's why the bourgeois themselves had to wage a revolution against feudal lords in Europe. They had no option. They knew that they can't keep on hoping for the decrees of monarchies. They knew that the only way to win is to wage a revolution. And that's what they did. They waged a revolution against feudalism, against feudal lords, against monarchies. And they could only keep those monarchies provided that they respected free market principles, provided that they respected capitalism, and provided that those kings and queens cooperated in the plunder of Africa, including directly participating in the plundering of those resources. And that's exactly why decrees don't work. What works is not decrees. It is material. It is the material interests. So at the center of problems is not the question of whether you can put the right legislation. And that's why Albert Luthuli was completely off the rails when he said in the 50s that let there be a good government as long as it legislates correctly, as long as it puts good laws. There is no such thing. That is total utter nonsense. Such a thing never happens. You can't put a law and solve a problem. You see, and that is precisely how, for example, the trade unions are so trapped today. As trade unions, we are so trapped today because there is a law that is wielded by the bourgeois, by the imperialists, in the form of labor law that restricts our movement. In other words, if I should end here, it is the law that is put by the ones in power for their benefit, for their interests, that they are willing to follow in both spirit and letter. And that's why you can't tomorrow wake up and gather because there's a lockdown. And they are willing to enforce this law. They are willing to send police to places like Ngobo, to places like Khayelitsha and Philippi. They are willing to go to places, for example, such as Alexander. They are willing to go to many other places in Azania. And they are willing to go there and enforce the law on lockdown because it affects them too. But poverty does not affect them too. You see, it is not in their material interest to end poverty. And it is in fact in their material interest to keep poverty. Where are they going to campaign when poverty has ended? Where are they going to campaign? Who are they going to lie to when everybody has education, free education? Who are they going to lie to and make an idiot when everybody knows what's right and wrong about history? So in other words, it is in the material interests of those in power to enforce pieces of legislation that solve their own problems, that keep them. That's why the colonial system put police. Police for what? To protect them. Were there police before colonialism? No. Were there courts before colonialism? Yes. What kinds of courts did we have as Africans? Right? What kinds of courts did we have? We had local courts, local tribunals. We solved African problems occurring in our vicinities. And these, at the core of them, were particular systems of thought which were rooted in the African custom and African culture, which we used as a framework to solve the African problems. And so the point here, sons and daughters of Africa, is I've tried perhaps to emphasize the genesis of our crisis as the section 1 of the Constitution, of the founding manifesto tells of the history, that the social problems we have, the economic problems we have a history. And that history is that of slavery, is that of colonialism. And so how do we then conclude this without belaboring the points too much? We conclude by saying that at the center, and that's what Raboroko makes in his Africanist case, is that the Charterists are yet to understand what politics really is about. And he says that politics is about material, vital material, spiritual and intellectual interests. It's about interests. It's not about good-heartedness and good feelings and sentimentalism. It's about concrete material interests. It's about who owns the means of production, who owns the land, and who then, as a consequence of that, owns the means of labor, the instrument of labor. And this, sons and daughters, is very critical. So what are we calling for then? In conclusion, we are calling for the reparations with respect to slavery and with respect to colonialism. We are calling for reparations, and reparations simply means that we want to be paid for the 500 years of systematic exploitation of our labor as Africans. We want to be paid for that. We want to be paid money, because we can quantify the extent to which the Africans themselves have been used in the plantations of the United States, and has been used in the cotton industry of Britain, and has been used in the collection of rubber in DRC for the purposes of the benefit of the exploiter. By the way, as a matter of history, after the World War, the Germans were made to pay for invading Belgium and for attacking France. They were made to pay. If you read the book written by John Maynard Keynes shortly after the end of the war, they were made to pay. But we were not in the position to make them pay. Why? They made peace with us. We made peace with them in 1991 and 1993. And we, what did we do to them? We made them deputy presidents, after the elections in 1994. Why didn't we ask them to pay? That's a critical question. The Germans were made to pay again for the Jewish genocide. I mean, the genocide they enforced against the Jews in Germany. They were made to pay. But in Tanzania, all the Europeans had to do was to say to us that they were sorry. This is not how concrete material justice works. This is only how sentimental justice works. And that's exactly what we did. We engaged in feelings at the point of, the systematic seizure of our land, the systematic exploitation of our land, the colonization of Africans. And we listened to all types of nonsense spearheaded by people like Mulder in Parliament, telling us that some areas of South Africa were empty, suggesting that if you found an empty space, you are then dealing with the problem of invasion. And that was precisely based on this view by Stuart Mill, this view of property rights, that if you enclose, that's actually their theory. They say if you enclose a property called land, then it becomes yours. What type of nonsense is that? What type of philosophy is that? And that's how they were able to legitimize the fact that they arrived in some particular areas of Azania and they were empty. Can you imagine that? People telling us that, some portions of Africa were empty, and therefore this is their justification for stealing it. Nothing could be more ridiculous. So we are demanding that there be reparations. We are demanding that these reparations can be quantifiable with clear mathematical precision. You can solve them. So I'm going to try to answer some of the questions that you are now posing. The first of these questions is that I should explain the meaning of the land in the context of the presentation. So if I could, I would say that land basically, in summative terms, is everything. It's the seas, for example, by which they came. So these folks didn't just come here in this country; they came by the sea, and that's how Jan van Riebeeck in the 1600s. That's how he landed in the Cape. It's because he couldn't land in Bloemfontein because there's no sea there. He landed by the sea, and that specific portion of the sea is our sea, and that's how he could land here. And when we talk of the land, also we talk about the fishes in the land. And you and I go to a fish and chips every day to buy some fish, and that fish comes from our sea. And that's quite strange because we don't know who lures the fish. We don't know who has the rod to lure the fish. We don't have the right to lure our fishes. The people who have the right to lure our fishes are the children of white settlers in our own country. This is the most ridiculous thing for any country that claims to be free. So land here is economy. Land in this context is wealth. And if you read Walter Rodney's book on how Europe underdeveloped Africa, you come to understand that the development of Europe meant that they would come here, extract the resources from underneath the soil, and take them to Europe. So they didn't only take the labor, the African labor, that is now in the diaspora, by the way, the so-called Black Americans and Black Europeans. They also took the land. And that is the critical problem. So the kind of land we're talking about as the PAC is not just land in the form of soil, it is land in the form of everything beneath, which is the minerals, everything besides, which means the waters, everything above, which means the space, which means the space where airlines fly, which is the ports where they land. But guess what? Who is renting for a port at the airport? We are renters in our land. They are landlords in our land. How could this be possible? So this does not make sense. So that is the problem here. I'm not quite sure whether I have put the thing on mute, whether you can hear me. Let me see. Please let me know if you can hear me at some point. So the point I'm making is that we are now landlords in our land. We rent an airport because we didn't supposedly build an airport. And yet in this country, every prison cell we see was built by us. We built the Robben Island in which we were put. We built everything in which we became exploited. The Dom Pass, for example, in this country was used both as a recruitment of labor and as a punishment of Africans at the same time. So we in this country, were arrested. We were arrested, and if we didn't have the pass, the Dom Pass, after being arrested, we were after being arrested, we were made to do forced labor, work for nothing, build prisons, build railways in our land, and we got nothing in return. And now we built the airports, we built the bridges, and I saw one of the bridges is terrible there in the Western Cape. They were the engineers who were building it, but it was our hard labor that was building it. We worked our sweat off in this country to build everything, absolutely everything. They imposed colonial taxes, against which Bambata fought, by the way, and lost, unfortunately. So that's what I mean. That's what we mean by the PAC when we talk about the land. We mean the space. And this happened in Europe when they were sanctioning the Russians. What the Russians did in return was to sanction them from moving in their space. When airlines are passing by, they shouldn't pass. They wouldn't pass on Putin's Russia space, because space is land. Land to us conceptually, it's not the soil. It's not the soil. The soil is for property development purposes. And by the way, we don't own property built in this land, in our land. We don't own property. We don't own the property market. Whether it appreciates or depreciates, is a matter of indifference to us, because we don't own it. But it's in our land. How could this be? So the idea of colonial dispossession is very crucial to the PAC. And I'm not today anyway talking about the land question, and I will take some other time to talk about the land question, but I will also take another time to talk about the race question. So the other question that is being asked is besides reparations, how do we move and how do we proceed forward within the current scenario and the status quo? So you can't move in the status quo by respecting the law. You've got to defy the law. I've made a point here that pieces of legislation don't solve problems for us. Pieces of legislation solve problems for the European, and it solves problems for the colonizers. And by the way, they are still colonizers, you see. So it solves their problems, not our problems. They use pieces of legislation and they give effect and power to a piece of legislation by a mere declaration. Have you seen what has happened in the declaration of the lockdown? All that had to happen was that a piece of words written in some constitution that we did not write allows a president of a country, any president of this country, to declare a state of emergency and subject everybody to a lockdown without a debate and a discussion. And suddenly Parliament is basically suspended. He consults whenever he likes. When he does not like, he cannot consult. It's up to him. So you've got to defy the law, because you have got to understand what the law means for us as Africans and what the law means for them as Europeans and as oppressors. So what does it mean for them? It means defending their interests. What does it mean for us? It means them defending their interests against us, against our interests. So and that's why we need to think about that's why we need to think about what it means for things like the labor law, for example. That the labor law is meant to guard the way the labor movement works. It's meant to basically cushion capitalists from a potential revolution by the working class. It's meant to tame the union leaders and specifically the working class, who are the majority of which are Africans. So it is meant precisely to do that. So that's why my point is, you have got to deal with the question of defiance. How did we, in the 1950s, before we were betrayed by the Kliptown Charter, how did we continue to undermine the system? You've got to undermine the system, and there's no other way to undermine the system than to challenge the laws, because when you challenge the laws on the streets, you are challenging the very structure that underpins those laws. So the question then is to undermine the law. You've got to undermine the pieces of legislation that are meant to keep the status quo. So you can't keep the status quo on one hand and gain liberation on the other hand. It's just not possible. So I'll try to see if there's any last question to deal with here, as I will be trying to summarize. So I have suggested that, except for wanting to get reparations, there is no revolution, there is no freedom that has ever been achieved by merely waiting on politicians to solve the problems. All revolutions in the past have always been waged by the people. In most cases, it has always been politicians trying to stand on the way of the masses to solve the problems. So what you need an organized revolution. And this organized revolution cannot be dealt with by the current social relations that we have. We've got to undermine the entire thing. I don't know, there's a gentleman here who suggests that, I just forgot to read his name, it's quite also difficult to read. He suggests that whose land am I talking about? Let's get the facts straight. I am very worried about such people. I think these people have no sense of history. First of all, let me just say for the record, Africans have always moved in Africa as Africans, and this continent has always been a continent of the African people. And by African people, I don't mean what the Europeans meant. I don't mean black people. I mean all people whose genealogical makeup can be traced nowhere else but here. I also mean those children of the soil who are in Europe as we speak, who are in the United States as we speak. And so this has been our land. And it has not been a European land, and it has not been a Dutch land. It has not been a land of the Dutch people or the Europeans or white people. It's the land of the African people. And so that question, I think people who make that argument have no sense of history. That's a problem. So the other questions ask why the ruling government doesn't expropriate land without compensation, and why South African children are not interested in agriculture. I think this is a very key question, and I would rather deal with the other elements of this question tomorrow when I deal with the question of race. But today I will only make a point. And that point is that, first of all, the word expropriate, if you look at your dictionary, the word expropriate means its other synonyms are confiscate, taking something by force from its owner. So what it assumes, and I want to make this point quite distinctly, when you say expropriate land, you assume by saying so that the person from whom you are taking it is an owner. is a legitimate owner. So then you say that let me take from it this land from that person by force. The problem with that is that it makes you a criminal when you expropriate land without compensation, because to expropriate is to say take something by force, taking somebody else's property by force. And this is why this concept is theoretically not appropriate for people whose land it is that they want to return. So we don't talk about expropriation of land without compensation, because both concepts should not be part of our vocabulary. We can't say expropriate land and then use the word again without compensation, because if you say expropriate, you mean take by force. If you say without compensation, you imply that there was a need in the first place to expropriate. And I repeat this point: to expropriate is to take something by force. Now, here's a question: if we take our land back, are we taking it by force? Are we taking it from an owner, from its original owner? Who's that owner? How did they acquire ownership? It cannot be. It doesn't work that way. It has never worked that way. We are the Aboriginals. We are the indigenous peoples of Africa. And Raborogo says that nationalism demands that, the people with a birthright in Africa should have their land back. And so, you see, so that's a difficulty, if you want then to expropriate that land, you are going to have two problems. One, you're going to be taken to court by white people. They will take you to court because, as Soboko was saying it, constitutional guarantees were given to white people in 1955 and in 1991 and 93, and they were sealed in 1996 when the Constitution suggested that everybody was a South African equally, when that was in fact not the case. That is the gist of the problem. So I'm going to extend on this question of expropriation of land without compensation in the context of the race question. And this race question, I want to address it more succinctly tomorrow. When I address this question, I will be addressing two theoretical propositions that are problematic. The first one is the neoliberal multiracialist proposition. And this proposition is based on the protection of white and black people. The idea of Oppenheimer, for example, who argued that he was against white domination, but at the same time he was against black domination. And this point was actually repeated by Mr. Mandela at some point in time. I'm not quite sure whether he met, Oppenheimer. I suspect that he did at some point, I think in the 80s and 90s. So that's the first framework, the multiracialist framework, the Rainbow Nation framework. And the second one, which is the other proposition, is in dealing with the race question today, is the proposition of color being at the center of politics. And if you read Raborogo, you will see how he addresses this question quite succinctly, that politics, at the heart of them is not the question necessarily of color. And he was there addressing the Kliptown Charter, which suggested that they were going to build a multiracial setup on the basis of protection of minority rights. So we will deal with that question at some point tomorrow. And that's where our talk tomorrow is going to be on. Let me see if this is the last question. I'm going to take this as the last question because I'm left with 5 minutes before the end of the talk. So the last question is that why is it important to understand the philosophical ethos that brought about the oppression of Africa and its peoples? So we've got to my response here should be that we've got to make a distinction first between philosophy, theory, and ideology. Ideology deals precisely with material interests. Philosophy is speculative thinking about ideology. In other words, philosophy is at the level of pure thought, supposedly, at the abstract level about perspectives of the world. So philosophy is basically secondary to ideology because what frames thought is not philosophy, it's not thought, it's the material interests of groups and individuals. And so European philosophy therefore was grounded, framed within an ideological position about the material interests of the European. And this is why the Europeans in 1884 could sit in Berlin and agree unanimously as Europeans in the absence of Africans about what to do in Africa materially, and then to hypothesize philosophically what kind of world they want to build. And that's why Aristotle could philosophize in a particular way. It was because he was an intellectual who was given birth to by the kind of Greek society he was raised in, where there was slavery. But in that society, he himself had a better place. And so that distinction for me is very crucial and very critical. So if then the question is why it's important to understand the philosophical ethos brought about by the oppression and its peoples, so it's very important really to understand that philosophy and that because its rationale is not from pure thought. In fact, there's no such thing as pure thoughts. Nobody creates ideas in their mind, otherwise no one would invent a plane, because they had no access to the empirical scientific evidence of a force of gravity. You see, so thoughts are not abstracts in a real sense. Thoughts are always drawn from the material world, from the material experience. That's why you could only increase the productive forces, the instruments of production, in the form of development of spindles, for example, in Europe, the development of machinery for faster production and so on. It's because thoughts develop within the context of production of commodities, but it then takes its own form once it has been abstracted from reality. It then assumes its own form, which then sometimes seem to be foreign about the world which it wants to talk about. And so the question you are raising really seems to me to be quite philosophical and theoretical, but both theoretical and philosophical are products of the material world, of the materialist conception of the movement of history, the dialectical march of history, from the contradictions of history. So philosophies therefore are formed within that specific context. I only have 1 minute to then summarize our talk today. So our talk today was to trace Section A of the Constitution in light of Section L. Section L asks the question, how shall we live in peace and harmony together as human beings? And this question is indeed very important. How can we live in peace and in harmony when we are invaded and colonized? That's why we have then said, as the PAC, that we must mobilize the Africans and rally them under the banner of African nationalism to deal with the question of dispossession of our land. And we must fight for the establishment of the Africanist socialist democratic order. And so we will then tomorrow deal with the question of the race, and how this question of race has transported itself from slavery, colonialism to post 1994, and how do we get out of the race myth. With all that being said, dear comrades, sons and daughters, and members of the Party of Land, including those of you who might have joined us from different ranks, we would like to thank you as the PAC for attending this particular lecture, and we hope that you can still post some of the questions that you think we will need to address a little bit more and clearer tomorrow. And let's meet tomorrow to talk about the race question. Let me suggest to you the kinds of books that you can read. You can read the book by Walter Rodney on how Europe underdeveloped Africa. You can also read too many of the speeches by Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe. You can also read too many writings of Kwame Nkrumah, very, very vital in also talking about his own evolution of thought. And maybe for now, let me recommend you those two books, and maybe I may recommend the other ones, but these two will talk about our own underdevelopment and the European development. In the final analysis, for Europe to develop, Africa had to underdevelop. We had to be destroyed for Europe to rise. That's why if we revolt and engage in a revolution, we, the Europeans, will be forced to go into a revolution. For as long as Africans don't go into a revolution, Europe is not going to go to a revolution at all, because we are feeding Europe. They are taking everything from Africa. But now they are stealing now better. They are allowed to steal by law, and we have allowed them to steal. It's time to end that. And with those words, I would like to thank you, and let's meet tomorrow again. IZWE.